Lady.
We're ready.
That noise.
We're so glad you could join us today. Welcome to National News Literacy Week, Kansas City edition. The News Literacy Project and EW Scripps present this week at the national level, and the Kansas City Public Library is proud to partner with American Public Square's Civic Education Initiative and our local journalists to bring you this National News Literacy Week, Kansas City edition. I'm Jenny Garman, and I'm the legal and government specialist here at the Kansas City Public Library. That means I get to connect you to legal and government resources when they could have the answers to your questions. That also means that I get to be a part of strengthening civic engagement here in Kansas City, which is very important to me. Because news literacy is such a broad topic, I'm going to also share a couple slides here just so that you have kind of a sense of where we're going here. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see the beautiful, thank you. So I'm just going to share to you this beautiful flyer here kind of lays out how we're taking care of this week. We have 3 days. We've divided it into 3 topics because news literacy is such a very broad topic. Today, we're going to be talking about democracy. Wednesday, we'll be talking about disinformation, and on Friday, we'll be talking about distrust. And all of this is relating to news literacy, to local journalism. And I'm just really excited. I'm excited to see participants here with us today from Kansas City and from St. Louis. And some of our participants are local high school students, and that is possible because of Tricia Maxfield from the American Public Square's Civic Education Initiative, where she helps students think about how we evaluate misinformation, disinformation, and bias. And Tricia, if you would say a few words about that, I'd appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Jenny. We are thrilled to be here with everyone. American Public Square is a locally founded and active not-for-profit here in Kansas City. And our founding mission is to bring unlike-minded people together to have fact-based civil discourse on important but yet wicked topics. I lead the civics education branch for American Public Square, and that means I'm lucky enough to work with young people in our community. You can see the 6 partners here: Belton High School, Day Centers, Lee Summit West, Scion High School, Oak Hill Day School, and University Academy. They are working on a curriculum. Currently, they've been working on it throughout the fall with their classroom teachers, or I've been going in to teach, where they dive deeply into questions of, can you agree to disagree? Questions of the difference between deliberation and debate and the importance of deliberation to a healthy democracy, as well as media literacy skills, which we hear from teachers, an urgent call to support them and get teachers and students resources and material to address media literacy. So we were thrilled to work with Jenny this week and support her as she puts on this program. If anybody has any questions for me about the program or American Public Square, I'll drop my email in the chat as we get close to the close. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Tricia. And Tricia's also going to help me monitor any questions in the chat. If you want to put in your very own question for our local journalists, we'll have Q&A time available at the end. Before we go much farther, though, I want to make sure everybody's aware, especially if you sign in a little bit later. This session is being recorded, so I'm asking folks to keep their cameras off if you're not a speaker, and keep yourself muted just so that you have your privacy protected. We're expecting that we'll have a way to have this transcripted a little bit, captioned after it gets posted to the library's YouTube website. And I will be sending out a follow-up email with resources mentioned in our session. We're going to mention a lot, I think. And if you are watching a recording, you can contact me at Jenny Garman at kclibrary.org for those resources. So you joined us knowing that news literacy has a vital role in our democracy, and that this week is part of an enduring effort to bring local journalists to the table with you and to inspire you to be a news consumer, to practice news literacy. We've all seen, and I tried to kind of illustrate that on the left-hand side there, that facts and truth and evidence are right alongside misinformation and viral hoaxes and disinformation conspiracy theories and what we read and see and hear in our daily lives. And that can feel overwhelming at times. It really can. But we can all learn to identify misinformation and disinformation through news literacy. News literacy is like flexing your puzzle solving skills, because you will identify credible information, you will seek out reliable sources, and you can apply critical thinking skills to separate fact-based content from falsehoods. According to the News Literacy Project, news literacy is the ability to determine the credibility of news and other content. It includes the ability and knowledge to identify different types of information and to use the standards of fact-based journalism to determine what to trust, share, and act on. Becoming news literate also means recognizing the critical role of the First Amendment and a free press in a democracy. People of all ages and backgrounds with news literacy skills can be more active in their communities and more equal and engaged participants in civic life. Maybe now, if you've wondered before, we've talked about civic life, we talked about democracy, you may understand why this is a personal and professional passion of mine, since I'm a legal and government specialist for the Kansas City Public Library. News literacy impacts nearly every facet of our lives. We depend on accurate, reliable, current information for our democracy, but also for our health, for our finances, for where we want to go, who do we trust as for sources of information. So we talked a lot about news literacy. Let's talk a little bit, in case you aren't familiar, about the News Literacy Project. If you visited my critical thinking and fact-finding page, you will see that I use a lot of their resources. They are a nonpartisan national education organization. They provide programs and resources for educators and for the general public, like you, like me, to teach, learn, and share news literacy skills. But let's get started with our program. This one focused on democracy, and meet our fabulous panelists. Celisa Calacal, from KCUR, Steve Kraske from KCUR, and Dia Wall from KSHB and I'm just so excited because I'm still thinking about the Chiefs game and that great post-game coverage. If you wouldn't mind, please, our panelists, would you please introduce yourselves and share with us what inspired you to be a journalist? Thanks.
Selisa, you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Selisa. I cover Missouri state and local politics and government for KCUR. I actually just started earlier this month, so super excited. What made me want to become a journalist? In high school, I was really into reading magazines, like Teen Vogue, 17. And then I've always been into reading books and stories. And so I think one thing that really drew me to journalism was the ability to be a storyteller, but like with real life. So the ability to, tell people stories, to still be a truth teller, but do it in a way that's engaging, that really brings people in so they can learn something new, I think was really fascinating to me. So being able to combine, I think those two things was a really big thing for me, and why I'm still in journalism. I love being a storyteller, and I love being able to, share news with people and tell people stories in a way that is engaging.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Steve, are you ready to go next?
Dia, you go.
What's up? I'm Dia. I anchor at KSHB, a proud EW Scripps company. So really excited to be celebrating and commemorating National News Literacy Week. I just think it's vital. I wanted to be a journalist because growing up, I felt like journalism challenged me. I was the kid who watched 60 Minutes every Sunday with my mom. And I just remember you would watch a story, they'd present the facts, and then all of a sudden there's a twist, right? there's always that piece of humanity that brings things like our government, our politics, our lives, into a greater focus and context, and that move us and help us make decisions from there. And so I've always wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, people who feel like they don't have an advocate or power. And so that's the biggest reason I wanted to be a journalist. I want to educate, I want to inform, and I want to fight for the little guy.
Thank you, Dia. Thanks so much. All right, Steve.
Yeah, I'm Steve Kraske, and proud to be on this panel with Celisa and Dia. I wanted to become a journalist, I think, for really selfish reasons. I wanted to meet interesting people and go interesting places. And when I was younger, that's really what I wanted to do. I think I was lucky. I teach it. I do a talk show at KCUR. I used to be the political writer for the Kansas City Star, and now I teach journalism here at UMKC in Kansas City. And unlike so many of my students, and I feel for them, so many of them can't figure out what they want to do with their lives. And I have always felt really lucky that I knew by the time I was in 5th grade, 6th grade, what I was going to do. I was going to become a journalist. I delivered newspapers, loved reading the paper. My parents were really into the news. My father was an editor. My mother was a political activist, very much involved in fair housing issues in Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up. And when I was a little boy, I remember my mother saying to me, she didn't want me answering the phone after 5 o'clock, because that's when the angry phone calls would start coming to my mom for the work she was doing in Detroit. And I thought, boy, there's something going on here, something that's very important. And I think to Dia's point, being a voice for the voiceless was also something that really appealed to me, and making sure that everyone knew of the problems that so many members of our community are facing, whether it comes to housing or they're poor and they don't have any rights at City Hall, they don't feel they have any rights. Telling their stories is something that was really important to me.
Thank you all so very, very much. It's great to have you here with us. And we're going to, again, if people came in a little bit later, just want to share, we're going to have time for questions at the end. And so please go ahead and put any questions you might have for our panelists in the chat. But I'm going to start with questions that I have. And the first one, of course, is a doozy. And so I want to make sure everybody has time to kind of go through this. What, in your opinion, as journalists, and you've all done some fabulous reporting, I'm curious what you think, how you see yourselves. You're storytellers, you're the voice for the voiceless, which is incredibly valuable. I mean, I just can't imagine not having you. What is the role of journalists in a democracy to you from where you sit? And Dia, since you were last introducing, do you mind going first?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, the role of journalists in a democracy is to keep us on the tracks, right? I think now there's a huge perception that journalists overwhelmingly are for or against. This is where news literacy comes in. If you're watching cable news, you're not watching news, you're watching commentary. Let me say that again. If you're watching cable news, that is not news, that is commentary. And if you are not an engaged and informed viewer, it can be difficult to tell the difference. And so for me, our role in a democracy is to be the person who keeps those checks and balances in place. There's a reason why we're the 4th estate. So we're not supposed to be friendly, right? Now we can be cordial, we can be professional, we can cultivate relationships and sources, and all of those things are really important. But in a democracy, it's our job to point out the red flags. It's our job to bring the ugly stuff at the bottom to the surface so that we as engaged citizens can then act from there.
Thank you, Dia. Steve, are you ready?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dia said, because I've learned in life that it's good to agree with everything that Dia says. And she's terrific. I'm a big fan of Dia Wall. But no, I would just point to something going on here in the Kansas City metropolitan area that begins to explain why we do what we do. Right here, there is a police department in Kansas City, Kansas. that has been under investigation now by the FBI and other agencies because it had become a police department that had gone rogue, that was out of control, that was simply terrorizing the citizens it was working for. And we learned about this a couple of years ago and went to work on it. And what we found out about the police department there was that all kinds of illegal stuff allegedly has been going on in Kansas City, Kansas, from police officers selling illegal drugs, from police officers harassing citizens, from police officers demanding unspeakable things from women that they came in contact with. Having sex with officers is what I'm talking about. And even to the point where one detective, a man named Roger Golubsky, who's under federal investigation now, he would have women come down to his office at Kansas City, Kansas police headquarters in downtown KCK in his office, and he would do things with them there that was so very, very wrong, right in police headquarters in downtown Kansas City, Kansas. Well, if it wasn't for the work of KCUR News, if it wasn't for the work of the Kansas City Star, that story would not have come to light. The FBI would not be investigating officers and their conduct from back in those days. This is going back 15, 20 years ago, but some of that conduct continued even to more recent times. This is important work. It's what journalists do. And it's shining a light in places where the light needs to be shined. Officials in Kansas City, Kansas didn't want these stories to be done. They weren't cooperative with us when we tried to do these stories. But journalists who know what they're doing kept plugging away and reporting and talking to people. And finally, some of the truth has begun to come out. It's important work. It's critical work. People in a community shouldn't be afraid of their police department. And that's what these news organizations have done in recent months, is to shine a light on this very, very dark chapter of our local history.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks very much. That's a great highlight there too. I appreciate that. Celisa, are you ready?
Yeah, just echoing everything that Dia and Steve said, I definitely think our role is to tell the truth, and to not be afraid in shining a light on what that truth is. And I think another role of journalists is, as the Fourth Estate, I believe our duty is to hold people in power accountable to their actions. So, as a Missouri government and politics reporter, for me, that looks like going to elected officials, going to people who have the power to make decisions, to pass laws, to enact policy, and going, why are you doing this? Do you think this is going to help people? And if I, get evidence that maybe something is not working, maybe a policy is actually actively harming members of our community, that's when I go back to them and I say, hey, did you know this was happening? Did you intend this law to have this effect on this community? And that's what I think a big part of our jobs is just follow people who are in power, track what they're doing, shining a light on them and holding them accountable to their actions and to, the impact that their laws have on members of our community. And I think it's really important for us to play that role and to not be afraid, as Steve said, to shine a light in places that, are dark, where, there's corruption going on. It's our job to be those people, to shine a light there, to not be afraid, and then to be able to deliver that news to members of the public in a way that can be understood, in a way that can be easily accessible. I think all of that is really important. And I think, that's one of our, highest duties.
Thank you, Celisa. And I know you and Dia have both mentioned Fourth Estate, and we do have a question. I'm just going to bring it in right now. Fourth Estate. Would you share your definition of that for our audience?
Yes, we have 3 branches of government, right? So as the Fourth Estate, we are designed to keep them in line, okay? It's our job to keep them in order and keep them in check. We are an essential part of any healthy democracy. And to echo both Celisa and Steve, what folks often miss, I think it can be easy to look at that coverage and say, oh, we're just picking on this police department, or we're anti this political party or this belief system. I hate to break it to you, we're not pro any of them. Okay, that's not our job, and that is not our role. We are the parent. So it's our job to give them the little rap on the knuckles and be like, yo, we see what you're doing, cut it out. And so the fourth estate essentially means, again, you have those three branches of government. You have your executive branch, your legislative, your judicial, and then there's us.
Enshrined in our First Amendment. And I would say too, I have to confess, I've never seen the show Hamilton, but I know that what it means about being in the room where it happens. And to me, that's a lot of what I see you do as journalists. You put us in the room where it happens, whether that's an everyday city council meeting or a bombastic city council meeting or something where just so you let us know, here's what's happened so that we then can make an informed decision about who do we, what position are we supporting? Where do we need to write a letter? Do we need to make this phone call because we're not happy with the direction and that's our elected official? So I want to say thank you very much for that. So then my second of my three prepared questions, because I am expecting that we're going to see questions from our students and from our participants, has to do with it's linking in disinformation. First Draft News is an organization that I like very much too, another nonpartisan organization, just basically shining lights in dark places. And we need that shared sense of what's truth, what's evidence, what's fact, because honestly, I love it. Where we can all see we're not in that place right now where we're sharing that shared sense. And one of the topics that came up in an interview of Dr. Wardle of First Draft News, it was in November 2021, was that local journalism will be the key to countering disinformation. She says, we need to change the mainstream media business model to be more participatory. Instead of having broadcast platforms figure out how to listen and engage people in their communities. So changing things up. And I'm curious if you agree with that. And I'm curious if you agree with that, how you are doing it. And I just want to mention too, KCUR is part of a new coalition, the Kansas City Media Collective. And, oh no, sorry, that's going to come later. Never mind. But that's just a little foretelling. So do you agree that we need to change up the business model and make it more participatory as a way of countering disinformation, as a way of having a shared sense of facts? Thanks.
Well, I'll hop in here. I think it is important for the media to give the public an outlet to express opinions going forward, because that is how our democracy works. It's based on public sentiment, public opinion, and that pushes lawmakers and legislators and members of Congress in one direction or another. So certainly at KCUR, on the talk show that I host up to date, people can call in and offer opinions. They write us letters, there's email addresses, there's all kinds of ways for people to connect with us. And we go out into the community and do forums during non-COVID times. All that stuff is good. Having said that, I also believe that it's important for people to understand that it isn't the media's responsibility to give citizens an opportunity to speak out. Every citizen, in my view, has an obligation to let his or her opinion be known. Folks, democracy is a contact sport. It's like football. You're supposed to engage with it. You don't just sit back in front of your TV set or your radio or whatever you're doing and watch it unfold in front of you. You engage with it. You write letters, you go to public meetings, you talk to your member of Congress, you know who your state lawmaker is, and you let them know how you feel. That's the way this works. It's not, I had a neighbor once stop me and say, well, I think it's kind of impolite to disagree with what the city council wants to do. It's not impolite. To Dia's point, you must be civil and be polite, but let people know how you feel. That's the way this works. And I think so much of that has been lost in this current context that we're in. where people talk to each other and they scream at their members of Congress or their state legislators, but they don't engage in civil, constructive dialogues like we're trying to have here today. So I think both things are true. The media needs to offer opportunities, but I think the public, needs to be engaged all the time in this business we call democracy.
Thank you, Steve. Selisa or Dia?
I can go next. I also think, agreeing with Steve here, that it's important for journalists, I think, to stay connected to the communities they cover and stay engaged with the communities they cover. Reason being, I think, historically, journalism has not done a very good job of giving voices or amplifying the voices of people who have been pushed to the margins, by our political parties, by our government. And so I think, nowadays we definitely have a duty to make sure that we do amplify those voices, and to make sure that their concerns are heard. And I think when we go out looking for stories, I think it's really important to connect with people in our communities and go, hey, what are you seeing? Is there anything in our coverage that you're not seeing that you want to see? I think all of that is really important to create a strong relationship between journalism outlets and the communities that they cover. And I think going to this business model and thinking about local news, this is something I think about a lot. We have a lot of news deserts across the United States. There are so many places that don't have, a KCUR, that don't have a Kansas City Star anymore. They don't have a reporter going to city council meetings every single week just to see what's going on, just to, talk to their, elected officials. And in places like that, that's where corruption can really fester, because people in power know that there is no fourth estate there to, be that check on them, to keep them in line. And that's really concerning to me. And I think, one model that I think about is the Report for America model. Essentially what they do, it's almost like a press corps in a way, or almost like Teach for America, but for journalism, essentially placing journalists into news deserts, into, very small kind of news outlets, and letting them, be that community reporter to cover really niche issues that goes undercovered. And I think that's really important. And I think there is an opportunity to really change how we fund journalism. I think sometimes for-profit journalism has not really yielded the best results, and has been too volatile for a lot of news markets. And I think that's why in the past couple of years or so, we've really seen a rise in nonprofit journalism models. The Kansas City Beacon is one local example that I can give. That's where I was working before I came to KCUR. You have bigger models like ProPublica. They do a lot of really, really great investigative reporting, and they can do that because they are funded by readers. So, instead of being beholden to, maybe some corporate, person who doesn't live in that community, who doesn't understand what that local community needs, instead they're listening to readers, they're listening to people who actually read their work, and they go, okay, what do you want to see? What do you want us to cover? And I think that is really important. And I think we're starting to see that kind of shift in, the journalism industry at large. And that's, I think, encouraging. And I think we should really explore other ways that we can, make sure we keep this industry going, and explore more ways where we can look at those news deserts and make sure that they're not deserts anymore, that they do have people there who are doing the work, who are being those community journalists, and who are the fourth estate in that community. Because every community needs a KCUR, every community needs, a KSHB, a Kansas City Star, every community deserves that.
Thank you very much, Dia.
My answer is the same. You get what you engage with. And so that's the challenge, right? If you want quality, in-depth reporting, you got to support it, right? That means you have to get subscriptions. That means you have to tune in to stations that are doing that kind of work. Because what's happening is we have such a proliferation of junk and stuff everywhere that's entertaining. It is not only sucking time, but it's sucking resource. So what happens is the quality experienced journalists oftentimes get pushed out. And so it's a fine line you have to toe, because I 100% agree. I think you have to be vested in a community. I think you have to be aware and care about what they care about when it comes to your coverage. But journalism isn't like grocery shopping, right? You may really care about education, but right now the issue may be corruption within a police department that's under federal investigation. And I think that societally, we have to be able to do both, right? We have to be able to say, I really care about education issues, Steve Kraske. But when I flip over and y'all talking about Galupski, I gotta be like, hold on, wait, this isn't right either. And I still have to engage. And I think that's the struggle. Like, this is not Burger King. You cannot have it your way all the time. The biggest story of the day or of the moment or in our community may not always reflect your personal priorities, but we collectively as a society got to come together and say, being an informed community is the most important thing, and engaging. So, I think we've become apathetic to a lot of things in a lot of ways. We just assume we're going to have good journalists covering City Hall. We just assume our city or school boards are going to do the right thing. Because I think for so long, these things have operated on analog in the background, and we haven't had to engage at the level that we're going to need to as a population moving forward to keep them going. And so I think it's important to reconcile that, right? And send the stories. It's 2022, y'all. You can find all of us online really, really quickly. You can get our email addresses. You can get cell phone numbers. Send me a DM on social media. And so it's one of those things where I think Kraske has the bite of this question. It's contact sport. You want a quality democracy, you got to get in there. You want quality coverage and journalism in your community, you got to contribute. You want good schools for our kids, you got to contribute. And I think now everything comes to us. So we have got to reprogram ourselves to tap in and do the hard work.
Jenny, I want to say one more thing while I have a chance with this audience and before I lose the thought, but I just want everyone to know that my experience being a lifelong journalist has been that the colleagues I worked with and the colleagues I've observed at other places like, KSHB 41, like the Beacon, where Selisa came from, KCUR News, journalists work really hard to get it right. And it's hard to get it right. It's easy to make mistakes. I have my students here at UMKC, we do an exercise where they interview me. And it's amazing. They write a little story about me. It's amazing how many facts they get wrong. But the world I come from, you can't make those mistakes. You make 3, 4, 5 mistakes in a year, you don't get a pay raise. You make 6, 7, 8 mistakes in a year, you probably don't have a job the next year going forward. We work really hard to get it right. So many institutions in this country are being criticized and ridiculed and punched in the gut these days because people say they're not what they purport to be. There's a lot of junk journalism out there and lots of different sites that are around. But the mainstream news sites, NBC News, the Kansas City Star, KCUR, the Beacon, people work hard to get it right. Do they sometimes make mistakes? You betcha. But people, they correct those mistakes once they make them, and they just try to get this first draft of history correct as best they can, the best version of the truth. Whatever the truth is, nobody knows really, but the best version of the truth is what people try to get and try to lay before the public. And I think that's really important for you all to know that people take these jobs really seriously. And if you want to wake a good journalist up at 3 o'clock in the morning, go to their bedside and whisper in their ear that they got a fact wrong on a story, that'll jolt them awake and they'll be worried about it for the rest of the night. And that's what good journalists are about, is making sure they make the best shot, take the best shot they have at getting accuracy into the stories they do.
That's a great, I appreciate that, Steve, very, very much. And Dia and Selisa, all of you for your answers. And you're giving me a great seg too to our Friday subject about distrust, because the reverse of that is, of course, how do you identify a trustworthy news source? We're going to talk about standards of professional journalists and how to evaluate a news source. And it goes to, we're only human, right? We sometimes make mistakes, even even with our editors and even with the fact collecting process, interviews and things like that, sometimes you get it wrong, but then you make it right. And how do you find that? So I want to say thank you so very much for all of that, and for working so hard, to bring us the truth and to bring us the stories. This is my last question, and it has to do with access. And I alluded a little bit to the Kansas City Media Collective, but I think this really is something that any journalist worth their salt is going to be about, which is in the Kansas City Media Collective. In your description, you talk about breaking systemic barriers to news access. And access, of course, is access to information is key. It's the foundation for any literacy, but of course, especially for news literacy. And of course, it's essential to our democracy. We have to be able to see the facts, to hear the stories. But when we talk about breaking systemic barriers to news access, I have some ideas of what those are, but I'm curious what you think those systemic barriers are, and how are you going to break them? How are you going to do that? And whoever wants to go first, I'm happy. Steve, you're unmuted, so I think it's going to be you.
Well, I just talked. Selisa, you go, or Dia, you guys hop down. I want to.
Fair enough. Selisa, are you ready?
Yeah, I can go. Oh man. Well, first, there are a lot of systemic barriers to news access. I mean, I think one of the major ones that a lot of people bring up is a paywall. A lot of people complain about news sites that have paywalls. The Beacon did not have a paywall, or still does not have a paywall. KCUR does not have a paywall. And I think it is important to have news that you can read without a paywall. And I think there are ways outside of that where you can support journalism and support the work that we do without running up against that paywall. And I think, paywalls, they're a barrier because, you literally can't read the article. And then what that gets into, and I think the danger there is that some people will click on an article, they'll read the headline, read, the one sentence, deck or description, and they won't be able to read the rest of the article, but then they'll form an opinion just based on, the tweet that they saw linking to the article or the headline that the article has. And that can be really dangerous for misinformation going around. People will make assumptions just based on that. And I don't think that's great for, an informed democracy and an informed community. Other barriers to news access, not everyone has internet. And it really is a shame that we're losing so much of our print newspapers. A lot of newspapers these days, they're not circulating every single day. It may be every other day or maybe just the weekend. Not everyone has access to the internet. And sometimes a lot of people get their news from, flipping through the paper every single morning. Another thing too that I think about, not everyone's first language is English. I know at the Beacon, one thing we tried doing is actually translating articles into Spanish for folks whose first language might be Spanish. I know KCUR does that as well, where we will translate some articles into Spanish. And I think too, not everyone consumes news the best when they read it. Sometimes, listening is the best way people can really digest news. And I think that's what KCUR does really well. Even when we do, newscasts, I think we really do our best to try and distill information into, really short kind of clips of sound. And one thing the Beacon, does still is we have a partnership, I believe with KU, if I have that right, where they will translate some articles, or not translate, but like they'll transcribe articles and, read them out loud. And then we'll post that audio at the top of an article just to make sure that we have enough options for people to consume news, to become more informed citizens. I think all of that is really important. And I think it is important for news outlets to really think about, what are other ways that we can serve our community outside of the traditional formats of, writing an article and posting it, on the website. Because I think it is important to acknowledge that people consume news different ways. Not everyone consumes news the same. And if we think that our audience is the same kind of person, we should really think about how do we try and serve everyone in the best way that we can.
Thank you.
I think for us, one of the things we are doing not only with the Scripps company, but at my station, is expanding our on demand. So like the Rokus, the Apple TVs, right? And those platforms, because I think for us, it's about going where the people are and where the people are shifting to. Selisa's 100% right. Everyone doesn't have access to internet, but that number is growing. And some of this federal infrastructure money that's coming in is really going to do a lot to address that problem. I know the governor in Missouri just announced a big investment there, but this is happening across the country because I think folks realize that's a serious equity issue for some of our smaller towns where they don't have that same quality of internet access. And so for us, it's about building out things like those 24-hour on-demand news cycles where you can get online and you can pull down articles, you can bucket by subject, topic, markets and cities and things like that. And so I think it's going to be continuing to build out on-demand platform. Yes, some people still do appointment television, and I don't know as much about my radio and print colleagues, their formats. But I know for us, it's about going where the people are, providing it in a way that's easily digestible and consumable for them. And especially like our apps and things like that are free. So you can hop on there, you can get all the content you want. If you want to know everything about Galupski, you can get on there and search, and you'll be able to pull all of those up and play them out in a way that works for you. I also think podcasting is going to be huge. Shout out to the millennials bringing the pods back because I think it's huge. I think as an industry, we have gone to shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Don't get me wrong. There's time and a place for that. But I do think this renaissance of long form, in-depth coverage is what I live for. And it makes me so happy because I think for so long, the attitude was like, oh, these young folks, the millennials, cranky old mom of mine, speaking for myself, don't want to engage, right, with quality news. It's like, nah, it just needs to be quality, presented well, and in a format that people can get. So if we got to put it on Apple TV for them to get it, we'll put it there. They don't have to watch at 5, And so I think even as an industry, the Nielsen ratings are now starting to count folks who are not on traditional broadband. It's 2022, y'all. Think about how long you've had an on-demand service. Cord cutting's been going on for the last 10 years easy. So I do think there are going to be more revenue streams that come from that. There are going to be more options for people. And I think journalism has not changed. The name of the game and how we do what we do has not changed. It just is a matter of us getting it to people in the way that they consume and digest it best. Because say what you will, good journalism lives on forever. You can go on YouTube right now and find quality investigative reports that were filed 10 years ago, and they're still good. So, I think it's just a matter of us putting it where people find it and where people are already at.
And I'll remind you, our listeners and everybody, that at the library, you can you can find in-person newspapers that you can flip through, and you can find a computer if you want to log on and see press reader and news from all over the world. So it's at your fingertips. It's on demand, and when your library is open, and digital branch anytime, any place, really, truly. I'm so grateful to all of you. I know you have a busy day. I know it was a busy night and everything. And so I'm so grateful. Those were my 3 questions, and you knocked it out of the park. I wanted to give a little bit of time to our participants here. This is a great question. I'm going to start from the bottom up. And here's a question from Tessa. Since no one develops in a vacuum, what are your thoughts or methods about addressing journalistic bias?
I'm going to break Steve's rule and go first. Okay. Journalism doesn't develop in a vacuum. So I think for people at home, this is why the news literacy piece is important, because if you're just watching the news and you see a story I do, you think that I'm the only journalist who's contributed to that report, when that's completely false, right? You have an entire structure. So there's generally a reporter in my shop, a reporter, a photojournalist, a producer, minimum 1 to 2 producers that you're going to be engaging with. You're going to have an executive producer, probably a content manager, managing editor, a news director. There's an entire umbrella of folks who have to come to the table. To Steve's point, we work really hard to get it right. So no one individual gets to go to work today and say, I think I'm going to go after Joe Biden. I think that's the move. And we're going to do a hit piece, right? It doesn't work that way. And so, yes, everybody brings their own experience and baggage, or whatever you want to call it, to the table when they're talking about why they believe a story is worth covering. What are some of the angles? But we legitimately sit at a table every day, twice a day. So we cover every shift with a minimum of a dozen people who are poking holes in that story. If you talk to this person, you need to go get that person. If you're going to go to this community, what happens to communities that don't look like that, right? And so the struggle right now is, in this world, when we talk about media trust, it is very easy to sow seeds of, well, maybe you can't trust them. And so my homework for y'all is to go look at countries, governments, institutions, right, that work to discredit the media. And then ask yourself why. Because overwhelmingly, they don't like what we have to say, or they want to dissuade you from believing what we have found. And so I say all of those things to say news doesn't happen in a vacuum, y'all. And so even if a reporter files something, or you see a story or an article that you may not agree with, I guarantee you there are at least a dozen other journalists and a handful of managers who have looked over this thing and done everything in their power to make sure that it is accurate, that it is verified, that it is source checked and ready to go. And so that would be my answer on that one.
I think that's a great answer. And I just would chime in quickly to say, to Dia's point, just because you disagree with a story doesn't mean it's biased. What journalists do is try to, paint a picture as fairly as we can and let the chips fall where they may. And lots of times people don't like what they read in a story, but that doesn't mean it's biased. And to Dia's point, there's a whole structure set up aimed at wringing out too much bias in any one story. Journalism schools across the country are set up to teach people how to write in as objective as a manner as possible. Again, you can't wring all the bias out, but you can wring a lot of it out, and to report as straight and as factually as you can. One of the most important lessons you try to instill in young journalists from day one in my classes is there's two sides to every story. You always present both sides, sometimes three sides, in any story that you present to the public. That's rule number one. I remember one time editors of the paper called me up like at midnight on a Sunday night. They were going to press with the paper the next morning. They said, well, we got complaints about students complaining about living in the dorms, but we weren't able to get a response from the university. Can we still run the story? My answer was not only no, but hell no. You got to get both sides in the story before you can print it. So that's another way you sort of keep a check on things. The last thing I'm going to say that people sometimes overlook is, if you're a political reporter like I was for a lot of years, if the Democrats think you're skewing your story to the Republicans, the Democrats aren't going to talk to you anymore. And likewise, the same way, if you're a police reporter and you aren't getting your facts straight and you're unfairly criticizing the department, the police aren't going to talk to you and you can't do your job. There is sort of this hidden layer of bias control that's out there that keeps reporters on the straight and narrow. If Selisa in Jeff City or Topeka is seen as somebody that is skewing her stories, no one's going to talk to her and she can't get the story she needs to do her job. That applies to all journalists all the time.
Yep.
How's that
Yeah.
happens? Yeah.
Yeah, I think everything Dia and Steve said, I definitely agree with. I mean, yeah, there's an editor who, if I have a story idea, I can't just go and do it. Like, I have to tell my editor, hey, I want to write about this thing. These are the people, I'm thinking of talking to. This is kind of, the angle, or this is like the newsy component that I think makes this a story. And then we talk about it, and he'll ask me a lot of questions. You should go talk to this person also. You should go talk to this person also. And then I take that, I go and do my reporting, I gather the facts, I write the story, and then the story goes through an editing process. It gets looked at by multiple people, and before it gets published. And so there is this huge kind of ecosystem behind a story. And oftentimes people just look at the byline and they go, oh, this person wrote it, I'm going to go after this person. I mean, really, like 5 or 6 or even more people looked at it before then. And if it's a big investigative piece, it was looked at multiple times throughout the story making process, not just one time, but probably a dozen times. And so I think sometimes news readers might forget that when they read a story, especially if it's a story that they disagree with. And yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, we try really hard to get it right. I mean, sometimes before a big story drops that I wrote, I can't sleep the night before because I'm going over every single quote I put in there. I'm going through every single interview I did. And I'm just like, oh God, what if I got this one thing wrong? Or what if I spelled this person's name wrong? Like, I'm going to die of embarrassment. So we take what we do very seriously. And, no journalist wants to be told that they got something wrong, or maybe they misquoted someone. We hate that. I hate that. And so I think a lot of people who consume news really jump at the chance to go after a reporter if they don't like what they wrote, but just know that there was a lot of work that was done behind the scenes that people don't see when you read the final product.
I really appreciate that. It's something where somebody might say, I'm going to go after this one reporter or the person who has this byline, where as nervous as you were to get that story out, you can say, I know you're not coming after just me, you're coming after me and all these people who helped me write that story. Thank you all so much for that one. And I wanted to see, so there's a question from Kim about funding for local journalism. As a fourth estate, do you feel like it would be better to be funded by tax dollars instead of being in the private sector? Ooh, I like that reaction already.
Well, KCUR public radio does get a small sliver, less than 10% of its money from the government, because there's a belief that this kind of system of information is valuable enough to the public that's worth giving a little bit of money to. But I sort of like the KCUR approach, where you ask listeners to support what we do. And there are so many people who do that no one person who has that much sway over the work that we do. I mean, I never have the head of the station or big donors ever come to me and say, hey, I want you to do a story on X. It just doesn't happen, and it's our decisions based on the daily look at the news, what we think we ought to cover. That's where we tend to focus. But I think that the listener supported idea is a really powerful idea, and it's been very successful for public TV and public radio, and I hope it stays that way for some time to come.
Thanks, Steve. I just saw another question too, unless Selisa or Dia, did you want to talk about funding or I can't believe we're almost at the end of the hour. I don't know where the time went. There's this question, can you discuss the balance between misquoting, out of context quoting, and sufficient quoting? That is not, those are, I'm not comfortable. Is that a spectrum? And who is?
Sure, there's a spectrum there. I think sometimes what I've run into a handful of times is, I'm talking to someone and, I'll pull a direct quote, but then, there's going to be a graph before that kind of leads into, we call it leading into the quote essentially. So I might be paraphrasing something they said, sometimes when you talk to someone, they might, talk in a circle, but I, as the reporter, can kind of understand what they were trying to say, and then I can distill that in this lead-in paragraph and then go into their direct quote that I think is really strong and really kind of encapsulates maybe what I'm trying to say in the article, or what that person is trying to say, or the position that they're taking. Sometimes we're all human. Maybe sometimes I might misunderstand what someone meant when they said X thing, or if someone, is trying to remember something, they might remember it incorrectly, and then, they might remember it a different way, once it's published, and then we have to go through a whole conversation, and then I have to go through a conversation with my editor to talk about, what do we do now? Is it a correction? Is it a clarification? Those are all the things that we kind of go through if we sense, or if we know that there might be not a total factual inaccuracy per se, but maybe like I misunderstood what, John Doe was trying to tell me when we were talking about X topic. But I think, when it comes to quoting, I think something we try to do is we try and pick the best quotes that came from, this person. And then, everything else they tell us, we try and kind of weave it into our article. A lot of it we use as contextual information, maybe something they told us, maybe they say, you should really look into this. And we're not going to put that in the article, but we'll use it as kind of, maybe a trail or a paper trail to lead into something else. So that's kind of how I see quoting. One thing that I try to do as a journalist, especially with big stories, and not with everyone I interview, but with like your normal average kind of John Doe sources, is before an article goes to publish, I'll call them and I'll say, hey, can I read back the quotes that I took from our interview, just to make sure that, I quoted you accurately, and just to make sure that, I'm understanding what you told me. So I'll just go back. I'm not going to read them the whole article. I don't do that, but I'll just say, hey, I quote you and I say, and when you said this, is that accurate? And most of the time, if I did my job correctly, they'll say, yeah, like that was right. Or maybe, I'll read them like a paraphrased detail of something they were telling me when they were recounting their experience. And that's their opportunity to go, actually, I'm really sorry, but this is really how it happened. And then I'll go, okay, gotcha. I don't want to, be inaccurate. I don't want to misrepresent you, especially as an average citizen. And so, then maybe I'll make a tweak. And those are some things that I think journalists can do to also continue to build trust with members of our communities, to show that we really do take our reporting seriously, and that we take fact checking and accuracy very seriously as well. So those are some things that I try to do in my own work to make sure that I'm, getting everything right as the best to my ability.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Celisa. And I want to put, there's one last question, kind of a question out there, but I think it's important, and I think we make a great wrap up with only 2 minutes left. We've had Anne share that and I feel the same way, that it's frustrating to hear people carp about mainstream media as if that's an epithet. And can you give us, as journalists, some good responses to people who want to talk about mainstream media, MSM, whatever? Can you help us out with that? How do we respond to people who use that term? Dia, can I ask you to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is this. You have to ask yourself the question, who is calling us this and why? Who's calling us this and why? I have made every political party in town mad. I have made every police department mad. I have made every city council, every school board. You're not always going to be happy with what I have to report, right? Mainstream media, okay? Do you want a mainstream doctor? Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where Steve is at this very moment grooming the next generation of journalists. Experience matters, right? We have a set of rules and policies and practices that have been in place for generations to keep our democracy alive, well, and thriving. And so for me, mainstream media is just a ridiculous term. Like it means nothing. It means less than nothing to me. So ultimately, all the people that you're sitting here listening to right now, we paying the same taxes you pay. Our kids go to the same schools your kids go to. We have the same frustrations with the potholes that you do. Most of us probably got no sleep because of that game last night, So I'm one of those folks where I just feel overwhelmingly that we have got to stop adopting the language of people who are coming in with a loaded motivation and intent, right? And so when you can truthfully not discredit the facts, you go to discredit the industry. And here's the deal, y'all. Like, there's no such thing as mainstream media. Journalism is a discipline, and it is a contact sport. If you call any station right now and say, I want to talk to X reporter, or I need the phone number for this reporter, I need this person's email address, you can get it. The people who are calling us this, new age epithet, as we call it, right? You can't get in touch with those people. They don't know where your kids go to school. They don't know what your tax rates are, but we do. I know who represents you, right? And so I think it's one of those things where we have to remember we're each other's neighbors. We're friends. We go to church together. Our kids are playing on the same little league teams. It's not my job, y'all, to present information that makes you feel good or endorses the political candidate you want or makes your neighborhood look better than the one next to it, right? It's my job to challenge you, right? It's my job to open your eyes to something that maybe you hadn't considered before. That's why I got in this business in the first place. And I would say the same thing about Steve and Selisa, right? We're constantly surprised by things. I can't tell you how many times I've gone on a story and I thought it was one thing, but it's something completely different, right? There's nothing mainstream about what we do. And so I would just challenge you, when you want to verify information, when you want to know that it's from a trusted source, not that great news organizations don't have YouTube channels. Most of us are spending a lot more time talking to people like you than we are building out sets in our basement. Okay, so I want you to be aware of the intent behind what people are trying to do when they say those things. They are trying to discredit us so that they can move the way they want to move. And so just know, like, there's nothing mainstream. Me, Celisa, and Steve can all go cover the same story. We can get the same quotes. We can get the same information. And I would guarantee you that although you may have a little bit of a difference in personality because of the kinds of storytellers, those facts, those takeaways, the overall scope of that story is going to be the same. And so I just want to encourage you guys, like, stay vigilant out there. Boy, it's hard for us right now, but just know, like, there's nothing mainstream about what we do. Nobody's sending out a mass call, go after this politician today. The industry doesn't work that way. That was a very long answer because I'm very passionate about that. Sorry about that.
I appreciate that answer. I appreciate the passion. I think that's what gets you through the tough times, right? You got a well to draw on right there. And I really appreciate all of you. It's 1:03 and I'm just so grateful to all of you. This is a great way to start this week. It's a great way to really learn more and to dig in about what news literacy is, about what you all do every day, and how it relates to democracy. And I am so grateful to all of you. Thank you also to all of our participants. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and say goodbye to you all in about 2 shakes. But thank you so much. And please, I'll send out an email to everybody who registered. Grateful to all of you. Thank you.